A few words about one of our sponsors, the Crypto Council for Innovation. The Crypto Council for Innovation is shaping global crypto policy and working with leaders in the US, EU, UK, and Asia. We collaborate directly with security professionals, law enforcement, and government leaders to keep them ahead of the rapidly changing crypto landscape. Our tailored workshops and learning programs provide national security personnel with the latest insights into what's coming next, helping them build connections with industry experts and fellow officials. Head to cryptoforinnovation.org to get in touch and join our next workshop. The Honorable Juan Zarate was the U.S. counterterrorism czar under President George W. Bush, and also the first Assistant Secretary at the Treasury Department to oversee terrorist financing and financial crimes. In those roles, he helped to design and implement U.S. rules for anti-money laundering and countering the financing of terrorism, rules that affect the way you bank today, and the rules illicit actors try to circumvent when moving dirty money. Several years ago, Juan wrote the groundbreaking book, Treasury's War, The Unleashing of a New Era of Financial Warfare. If you want to understand how sanctions and money laundering relate to national security, he's your guy. It's an honor to have Juan Zarate as our guest, someone whom I deeply respect. In this conversation, Juan gives us his take on how economic and financial threats have evolved and what the new Trump administration needs to prioritize. He also reflects on the successes he's seen stemming from the use of sanctions and is also honest in addressing their limitations. Juan Zarate, are you ready to get designated?
Let's do it. Yeah.
All right. Juan, it's always great to talk to someone who has been on the inside and has a lot of institutional memory. I want to ask you, out of all the national security threats that you remember from the end of, let's say, 2008, which of those threats are you most surprised that they still exist?
Ooh, yeah. That's a good question. Yeah. I love being on with you. You're always so smart and insightful. Thank you. Um, I think what surprises me is that um, the cybersecurity threats that we saw uh, clearly emerging. They were already existing at that time. In some ways, have only gotten worse or have metastasized in ways that make it harder to manage, and certainly in ways they've taken advantage of other technologies like ransomware, right? And so it's not that it's a surprise that it's still around, it's just that it's so persistent. And in some ways, you can anticipate that, but I think that's part of it. One other thing I would say, Yaya, is in many ways we were anticipating the convergence of nefarious actors, malign actors, rogues, however you wanted to label them in the international system. I called it in my book, The Alliance of Financial Rogues. And I know you've done lots of work on this, especially in the crypto context. I think I haven't been surprised about it, but I think it's interesting that we've seen much more clearly this axis of resistance, the alliance between China and Russia and Iran and North Korea, and how much that's accelerated in the last few years. Again, we saw glimmers of that, and we were certainly worried about it, certainly worried in the context of illicit finance. But the fact that that's accelerated so much, and now you've got North Korean troops deployed in Ukraine, you've got Chinese vessels, which may or may not have been helping cut undersea cables on behalf of Russia. You've got, Iran supplying drones into the Russian war machine. All of this is a pretty stark and open reflection of that alliance. And so that would be another element of surprise to a certain extent.
In the intel world, we used to talk about an elevator briefing, which is when, you find yourself in the elevator with a principal like yourself, like Juan Zarate. And as an analyst, you have to give him, him or her the top the quick beat on what are the key threats. And in your role now, you're outside of the government. So I'm wondering if we could think about, if you were in front of the, let's say, the Trump transition team, and you just had an elevator ride to tell them what are the key financial economic threats that they need to focus on, what would you tell them?
I think there are three things that concern me most, Yaya. One is this convergence of illicit actors, both state and non-state, that are very much willing to and able to misuse the financial system, misuse technologies like crypto to not only profit, but then to advance their interests, often in opposition to the United States. And so this idea of the alliance of countries like China and Russia and Iran and North Korea and Venezuela, uh, many of which are sanctioned in different ways, coming together to support each other and to engage in illicit activity that not only threatens our national security, but also threatens the integrity of the financial and commercial system. So it's that convergence of that alliance, I think, that's really threatening. In addition to the kinetic threats and the military threats that are attached to it, I think. Secondly, is the challenge to American systemic dominance in the international financial system. The attempts, the open attempts, and it's no longer veiled. You hear it in the BRICS Plus conversations. You hear it from leaders like Lula da Silva from Brazil. A real desire to break the reliance on the U.S. dollar, find alternatives to the American-backed financial system, to create alternate payment systems and cross-border settlement processes that don't rely on London or New York or even Tokyo, but have other sources of both legitimacy and facility. So that, I think, is very important because there's a systemic attempt to take us out from the middle and to replace it with something else that's either Chinese driven or otherwise more chaotic. Third is, I think we always have to be aware that the actors that we're most worried about from a security perspective are going to find ways to use the financial and commercial technology systems against us. They're going to try to get access to things that we're trying to prevent them from getting access to, export controls. They're going to try to get into financial systems despite sanctions. And so we're going to have to figure out how we're using the full toolkit of economic and commercial measures to isolate those rogues and those that present a threat to us. And sharpening that strategy, sharpening those capabilities is something the new administration, I think, needs to concentrate on.
Well, Juan, with those threats and those risks that are around, then what would you say would be the state of those tools that the US has, right? I mean, I know you're modest, but you were a part of that effort to create and to enhance US tools for financial pressure, for anti money laundering, and to counter terrorist financing. Obviously, the sanctions piece is there, and you've talked and written so much about that. But in 2024, especially when there's a lot of pressure and people are saying, these tools, these sanctions tools, may not be so robust, what would you say is the state of US tools of economic power?
Well, yeah, I think first and foremost, we have to recognize in 2024, we're talking about a full range of tools, right? So not just the classic sanctions we've thought about for the last 20 years, which is the isolation of rogue actors from the financial system, denying them access to goods or to institutions. That's really important. We'll get to that in just a second. But you've got anti-money laundering tools that are intended to prevent illicit capital from getting into the system. Some real problems with that system. There's export controls. There's investment security, both inbound and outbound, that's been evolving and is in formation as we speak. And then there's positive economic tools. And so there's a full spectrum of these tools that in some ways reinforce each other and that are very much at play when you talk about economic statecraft. And I think the reality is the United States still has predominance in many of those fields, whether you're talking about exquisite semiconductors for AI purposes, or you're talking about access to the US financial system, or reliance on the dollar, or the predominance of dollar-backed stable coins, which is the predominant use and trade in stable coins. The US and the dollar and its system and its technology still hold a primary place, not solely, but a primary place along with its allies. So those tools have to be nurtured and considered together in a system where we don't want the U.S. government to co-opt the private sector, right? We don't want to become a Russia or a China, but we have to realize we're having to compete with those countries that are applying state authoritarian capitalist models to the system. But with respect to sanctions in particular, Yaya, I think we're at a real inflection point. And by that, I mean three things. One, I think in the post-Russia context, in particular in Europe, there's a recognition that sanctions are not just an interesting part of or an adjunct to diplomacy or an element of economic statecraft, as I was just describing. It's actually a part of warfare, right? This is part of the hybrid warfare that Russia's engaged in the context of the use of its energy resources. China's engaged in some of this with what it's been willing to do to shut down exports of rare earth minerals, for example, or some of the supply disruptions, for example, to U.S. drone makers that are then supplying those drones to Ukraine, right? So there now, I think, is a more fundamental recognition that sanctions are a part of the new form of warfare that we're engaged in. Now, it's not a shooting war, but sanctions fundamentally are part of that, which is different than simply, you do this to signal opprobrium or as an alternate to diplomacy. The second thing is we have to be very careful, and many voices have said this for many years, to not overuse sanctions. But by that, I think we mean not that we not use sanctions when we need to for clear national security reasons, but that we not proliferate sanctions and overuse them for what are seen as purely political reasons, or to put our thumb on the scale on some particular issue in some particular country. And I think we run the risk of that when sanctions are being used as a tool of moral opprobrium or policy disagreement, as opposed to a tool of coercive statecraft or even warfare. And so I think that has to be thought about, because the more that we overuse sanctions in ways that dilute their power and effectiveness, the more that the sanctions just are going to be less effective, and the more that we're going to drive actors to find ways around them and are going to have less cooperation, frankly, to make them effective.
Juan, do you think that around sanctions the tables could ever turn? Maybe not now, but can you imagine, or do you see any indicators where sanctions could be turned towards the United States?
Absolutely. Yeah. And this is something I warned about in Treasury's War at the tail end of the book, talking about the coming financial wars. It was clear that the Russians were already thinking about this in the context of use of oil and gas as both a sword and a shield in terms of sanctions or economic warfare. The Chinese were already threatening U.S. companies that were supplying military weaponry to Taiwan. They had taken some demonstration effects. This was back in 2011, 2012, 2013, to let produce from East Asian neighbors that were challenging them in the South China Sea, letting bananas rot in the port, with the Philippines, for example, or denying rare earth mineral exports to countries like Japan as part of diplomatic engagement and confrontation. So it was already very clear that you had countries thinking about how they use the power of their own markets, their own resources, to influence and to coerce. And that's in essence sanctions, right? And I think you've started to see that in different ways, with the Chinese being more explicit. They have, lists of people that they designate now. They take actions against different companies. They certainly have designated or have sanctions related to Taiwan now. And as I've mentioned, in subtle and not so subtle ways, they've shut off supplies of necessary minerals and components for purposes of the United States, and in particular for this drone maker that is exporting to Ukraine. So in a way, we're already in that environment where other countries are recognizing they can use sanctions to exclude actors, to punish, to send messages.
Mhm.
And we're certainly in an environment where it's not just the US that applies these tools. The EU, London, Japan, even Russia, Moscow, others are applying these tools of economic coercion for their national security interests.
Hmm. So, in this environment of economic warfare, competition, competition slash warfare, where every country can assert its interests or try to, um, what would you say about the incoming administration in this environment? You don't have to get specific about specific individuals, but just the Trump administration is coming in. Do you see any strengths? Let's start with strengths. We could talk about weaknesses, but what strategic strengths might the administration bring?
Well, the administration has already signaled that they want to use sanctions more aggressively again with Iran, uh, moving back to a maximum pressure campaign. And for those of us who've watched this regime over time, the sanctions regime itself, um, it's a regime like any other that needs constant tending, right? It's like weeding a garden. Um, and you can't expect sanctions to work over the long term unless you're constantly tending to it or pressurizing it. Now, there's debates as to when you apply sanctions or not. Does it provide diplomatic openings, et cetera? So all that's important. But um, what's interesting about this administration is they clearly want to choke off sources of capital to Iran, which creates interesting next steps, but also complications, because we know, for example, that China buys a lot of Iran's oil. We know that there are growing connections between Iran and China, certainly Iran and Russia out in the open, um, and lots of challenges with Iran stoking conflict, of course, around Israel through its proxies and even directly. So it's a challenging environment, but I think this administration is coming in with a pretty clear strategy, which is we're going to apply maximum pressure with our financial and economic tools to deprive this regime of resources that it needs, either to continue its adventurism with these proxies, or develop nuclear programs, or to do other things that are dangerous. Again, not without complication, but that to me strikes me as a very clear strength and something we're going to see.
And you've watched, multiple administrations, whether you were in them or, of course, outside for the past decade plus. Um, can you pinpoint potential weaknesses?
Yeah, I think maybe a couple of things. One, every administration comes in, wondering whether or not they need to use sanctions, how effective sanctions are. The Biden administration, for example, came in with the mind that sanctions were being overused. They were too unilateral. There was a report that the administration put out. And then the reality of the world sets in. The reality of the Russian invasion of Ukraine in particular set in. And that reality is that uh, the US government doesn't have that many tools of coercion to apply. And often sanctions are seen as the first and last tool to be applied to try to coerce a counterparty or an adversary, not only to deprive them of things, but to make it harder for them to operate, and maybe even in an ultimate way to affect their behavior. Right. This was the hope, certainly, in trying to deter Russian invasion of Ukraine. Didn't work. Didn't happen. And so I worry a little bit about that kind of instinct of, well, we need to maybe rethink sanctions, et cetera. And then the reality of the world will hit, and they will simply resort to the same playbook and the same things we've done in the past without, frankly, being more thoughtful about it. So I worry about that. The other thing I worry about is, and you've heard me say this before, sanctions are most effective when they're well understood, when there's well-reasoned data and justification for them, and when they're in service of, frankly, international security issues and issues of risk for the financial system. And so that means even if somebody doesn't like a sanction or designation from the US or from Europe or London, if it's in furtherance of something that's well understood, preventing terrorist financing, preventing proliferation, preventing high-end corruption, kleptocracy, all of which most of the countries around the world, the vast majority of them, have agreed to fight, combat, prevent. If it's in furtherance of that, it's very hard to argue against it or to buck it or to suggest this is an abuse of the power. On the other hand, if sanctions are being used in very political, tactical ways, seen as getting back at particular politicians or regimes, you've seen this recently in the threats to sanction particular ministers in Israel for things that they've said. The Europeans have threatened it, London, even the U.S. administration has threatened it. I think that's dangerous. You start to, in a very real way, pick sides, politicize, and use sanctions as frankly, just a tool of moral and policy opprobrium, as opposed to a tool of coercion in more understood and universal ways. And so, every administration falls into those traps, thinking they don't need to use sanctions or maybe want to change the use and the reality of the need. And then also a tendency to maybe want to use these in political ways that then does damage to their credibility and legitimacy.
Juan, you make me think about something which might be controversial for me to ask. So I'll ease
Ask
into
it. Ask it away. Yeah. I don't have to
Well,
answer, but let's go.
well, I'm going to ask for a judgment call.
Okay.
Maybe two questions. I mean, the first one is, this is the easier part, maybe, which is, if you were to grade American use of sanctions over let's say the past 20-ish years, 20 years, A, B, C, D, F, what would you grade? How would you grade our use of sanctions?
I think it's an A minus. I think it's an A minus. It's yeah, because I think over the past 20 years, and I say that for a couple of reasons. One, I think over the past 20 years, and I try to lay this out in Treasury's War, we did some very innovative things in ways that injected sanctions into the broader risk calculus of the private sector. Right, that was something. It's almost obvious now, but pretty innovative, that we weren't just trying to isolate countries with trade sanctions, these kinds of things. We were trying to inform the risk calculus of banks, major corporates, shipping companies, insurance companies around the world to consider the risks attendant to doing business with rogue regimes, rogue actors, those that are trying to access the financial system illegally, et cetera. That, I think, was highly successful. It's why the sanctions hurt so much against Iran, despite the fact that Iran had been under sanctions since 1979, right? Or the reason why the North Koreans, after the Banco Delta Asia Section 311 action in 2006, were crying to get back to the negotiating table, the six-party talks, to have the sanctions lifted. They'd been under sanctions before, and none of the Kim regime was coming to New York to go shopping. So what was it? It was this idea of isolating rogue activity, rogue actors from the international financial and commercial system, upon which these regimes and actors rely heavily if they're to do anything of scale or import, right? They need access to capital, they need access to goods. And if you make it harder, costlier, and riskier for them to do that, you've started to succeed. And if you change their behavior as a result, you have a strategic win. And I think we did that in many ways. In the last few years, and it has nothing to do with me, the people at Treasury, State, White House, both administrations, both political parties, done a very nice job of refining the tools, finding different ways of using the tools against higher end targets, a G20 economy in Russia, dealing with debt and equity related concerns, going after oil interests, going after different kinds of oil transactions, right? There's more nuance around how sanctions are being applied to try to reestat how they work. The reason I don't give our team an A or an A plus is I don't think we've done a good enough job of figuring out how the sanctions play with other tools, cohesively. And I think that's yet to come. I also think we haven't thought through or executed. And, these are things I tried and we didn't get them done. How do you use positive economic power to influence and to complement what we're trying to do with sanctions? Because with sanctions, with Section 311 of the Patriot Act, with these other tools, these are tools of exclusion. What are the tools of attraction and inclusion we can bring to the table? U.S. Western capital, greater insurance for investment from abroad, charitable backfill where that's needed, development aid and assistance in interesting ways. So if we're going to challenge and try to exclude actors, we're going to have to find ways to fill the gap and offer alternatives. That's certainly the case we've seen with China. And I think that's something that we haven't done well enough as a part of sanctions policy.
So it sounds like you're saying, right, that but in addition to these negative, these consequences through sanctions, there should be incentives, economic incentives. Juan, can you give us an example of how that would work? In what situation might the U.S. provide a positive incentive to get a policy objective overseas?
Maybe a couple of examples, Yaya. The first is something I've argued for a long time, which is to think about sanctions delisting or lifting of sanctions as a strategic tool unto itself. That is to say, we often think about sanctions in a very rote, binary way, right? You're either designated or you're not, right? Sanctions is either on or off. It doesn't work that way. And what we have found and seen is designated parties, especially ones that are designated for a very long time, and especially ones that are commercial actors, often want to find ways out from under the sanctions. Now, sometimes they're illicit bad actors and they're just trying to evade sanctions. Sometimes they want to cooperate, and sometimes they want to get out from under the restrictions because they're too heavy. They can't do business. Their family's affected. Board members that were on boards with them, they have to isolate themselves. They just can't do business the way that they'd like to. And so we've seen this in particular with the global Magnitsky regime that has gone after individuals and companies for corruption and human rights abuses. These are often ongoing concerns. These are companies that are producing things. These are they're mining companies in Africa. So there are interesting questions about how do you not only apply sanctions, but prepare immediately for what the delisting looks like in a proactive way to say, look, if you want to get off this list, if you want to cooperate, here are the 5 things you need to be doing. And frankly, not wait for lawyers to show up at the door of OFAC to do that, but to say, this is part of the strategic plan. And we're going to do that in concert with the host government. We're going to do it in concert with those that are maybe affected by all this. Then it becomes a dynamic tool. And frankly, those actors then get benefits, perhaps, of being able to do business now and being recognized as having good compliance systems and, being able to bank with Western banks. And so, though it's not like funding the way you would imagine, it's a real benefit coming off of the stick of the sanctions to convert it almost immediately into a carrot, right? And I don't think we've done that quite well enough yet, but I think you start to see rumblings. We started to see rumblings of this with the way that we're thinking about the competition with China, especially in places like Africa. How do these sanctions not hobble our ability to operate, but maybe even enable our ability to operate in some of these environments? Second example, I'll be real quick about this, is, we often talk about the investments that China makes, for example, in the BRI project and infrastructure investment, and we compare it to what the U.S. provides and the U.S. government does, and even the budget at Exim or the Development Finance Corps, et cetera. And the Chinese investment overwhelms the U.S. investment. It's often loss leading, right? It's operating under a different model. But if you look at what Western capital, independent investment from Western capital, American VCs, private equity funds, you look at sovereign wealth funds, you look at individual investors, it overwhelms the Chinese investment. Now, not all the investment is going to go to infrastructure in Burma, but the reality is we haven't thought through well enough how we align allied capital, if you will, capital that can be productive for its own purposes and provide the returns that investors want, but also meet the needs and the goals of national security in complement to sanctions, right? And that is to say, you want to incentivize the right behaviors, the right activities, the right access to capital and other things. You don't just want to be excluding actors. And so if we could find ways of applying sanctions and applying more of the positive investment and investment opportunities as a result, I think we'll be more successful.
A few words about one of our sponsors, the Crypto Council for Innovation. The Crypto Council for Innovation is shaping global crypto policy and working with leaders in the US, EU, UK, and Asia. We collaborate directly with security professionals, law enforcement, and government leaders to keep them ahead of the rapidly changing crypto landscape. Our tailored workshops and learning programs provide national security personnel with the latest insights into what's coming next, helping them build connections with industry experts and fellow officials. Head to cryptoforinnovation.org to get in touch and join our next workshop. You've seen a lot in your career, Juan. Can you share some of the successful experiences that you had with these sorts of tools, fighting financial crime, fighting illicit actors?
Yeah, I often return to and frankly resort to what we saw the targets of these tools saying and doing, right? Because it's often the question, do sanctions work? They really don't work. How do you know they work, et cetera? And there's different metrics depending on what you're asking sanctions to do. I will tell you that in my experience, whether it was with Al Qaeda or with Hezbollah or with Iran or with any other of the target states or non-state actors, the sanctions were never perfect, of course, but we would see very clear evidence, including from what they would say to each other and out loud, that these sanctions hurt, that they were being disallowed access to the financial system, that donors were drying up for the activities, that people were afraid to be associated with the targeted parties, that even those that claimed to be political allies with the targets were backing away because of the risk and the taint of these kinds of sanctions. And so, I don't think there's probably no sanctions program, including the Cuba program, which often gets derided as the one that never worked because the Castro regime was never toppled. Even the Cuba program demonstrated that the ability to constrict the ability of these targets to access whatever they were trying to get access to actually constrained their ambition, changed their behavior, and hurt. And I said it before, the strategy that we had was, look, you're not going to stop every dollar or yen or pound or euro from getting into the hands of bad guys, but you're trying to prevent that. And what you're ultimately trying to do is make it harder, costlier, and riskier for America's enemies to raise money and move money around the world. That's what we did. And I think we saw evidence, whether it was Al Qaeda communications or the North Koreans at the negotiating table,
Hmm.
that this stuff hurt. They didn't like it and they wanted it lifted.
Hmm. So so you were able to see direct reactions. You were able to see positive results from the tools that you helped to support or put in place. What about times when things didn't work?
Well, there's a lot of times things didn't work. Um, and I'm thinking broadly about sort of the national security sort of environment itself. And so, I go back to this idea that, we didn't do a good enough job in figuring out, with the vast resources of the US government, the vast resources of the US private sector, how you actually affect in positive ways environments where enemies were taking advantage of either the actions we were taking, like sanctions, or the absence of our presence, or the disillusionment or anger at US policy. You know, we saw this, and Yaya, you and I worked on some of these issues on countering violent extremism, right? These
Hmm.
issues where we weren't really able to figure out how do you undermine ultimately the credibility of these ideologies? How do you weaken their hold in populations? How do you make these environments hostile to these ideologies from taking hold? And I think part of that failure was not not figuring out well enough how to use the tools of financial inclusion, opportunity, uh, and investment, frankly, as ways of influencing those environments. I just don't think we did that well enough.
So, what would you tell the incoming administration, or just anyone currently working on these issues in government? Um, what would you tell them to do differently?
Well, I think this goes back to the elevator pitch to the administration. I think the first thing that really has to happen is everyone needs to take a step back and recognize we're in a different form of competition with China, with Russia, with Iran, with North Korea, with Venezuela, and a whole host of non-state actors, proxies, terrorist groups, militias, etc., that are trying to do something different here. They are not only trying to evade US sanctions, they're trying to undermine the ability of the United States to even use these tools at all in terms of coercion. So they're trying to create alternates to the SWIFT bank messaging system. They're trying to experiment with the digital yuan to settle cross border payments, like with the Enbridge project. They're trying to create new channels of commerce. The BRICS Plus is sort of the ambition of that. I'm not so worried about that, but it's the ambition. They're trying to attack the fundamentals of the dollar, and so I would argue to senior policymakers all the way down. You have to take a step back to realize we're in a different context here, and the sanctions play a key role in that context, and even conflict, I would call it. But it's just one tool. And if we continue to just use sanctions as the reactionary tool to respond to an invasion, or something somebody said we didn't like, or some act of criminality, we're going to start to lose the thread on the broader conflict here. And we've got to think about all of our tools in concert. And so that would be the big thing I would say is we need a broad national economic security strategy and approach that takes the best of what sanctions can do and combines it with the other tools of statecraft and influence that we need to bring to bear.
Well, one, what about the everyday person at home, right? These are big threats. These are big issues around state actors in particular. Um, the US is looking more inwardly, right? I think as a population, I think that even the election shows us, right? There's this sense of looking domestically, what's going on with us here, as it should be, right? In many ways. What should the everyday person who's at home thinking about their everyday life? How should they be seeing these risks impacting them, and what should they be doing?
Um, it's an interesting question. President Bush would often say, when we're in the sit room or the Oval Office, he'd say, "Look, we're worrying about these issues so that citizens, everyday citizens, don't have to worry about these things." Right? We'd go through the threat matrix. We would be worried to death over this threat or that threat, and thankfully, there's nothing that citizens ever had to see or worry about. But it was our job to worry about it, right? And so there's an element of this where it's the job of the government to defend our national security and to promote our interests in ways that are advantageous to all citizens, right? Communicating that and figuring out, how much you leverage this form of power, that form of power, obviously part of policy debates. But I think there's some simple things that everyday citizens can do. I think on the cybersecurity side, I think basic cyber hygiene is very important. You've got non-state actors and state actors like the North Koreans, for example, taking huge advantage of crypto and cyber heists to the tune of billions of dollars. That's then funding them to fund their nuclear program and pay their generals and pay to send troops to Ukraine. These kinds of things. Um, that boils down to institutions, companies, exchanges, banks, individuals, having better cybersecurity, and a lot of that devolves to just better cyber hygiene.
Hmm.
More than 95% of most cyber hacks are enabled by a phishing campaign, somebody clicking on the wrong thing, and so just being more aware of that kind of hygiene is actually really important. It's important to individuals, uh, personal safety of their data, safety of their finances, but it collectively helps if we're all better at defending against that. So that's something simple, but it's important.
Hmm.
I think, secondly, we have to recognize, Yaya, that um, malign actors, and we've seen this with the Russians and the Iranians and the Chinese, are trying to take advantage of our political divisions, and they are stoking debate. Some of it is misinformation, some of it may not be, but they're trying to stoke divisions intentionally.
Hmm.
So my plea to my fellow citizen is, beware of um, divisiveness. Um, in part, it's sort of artificial divisiveness. I'm not saying don't be skeptical of the government. I'm not saying don't debate. I'm not saying don't read a bunch of stuff on whatever sources you want. But let's be careful not to demonize each other in the context of political debates or otherwise, because that's exactly what our enemies outside the United States are trying to stoke. So we need a bit of patience with each other, a bit of national resilience in that regard, and a recognition that the bad guys like it when we're tearing each other apart. And so we need to be careful about taking that too far. The final thing I would say is the fundamentals, and we haven't talked as much about this, but the fundamentals of our power in the economic and financial domain is the fact that we've got the largest, most vibrant economy in the world. We've got a financial system, a capital market system that's open, that's trusted. The rule of law, is fundamental to it, and is highly attractive. The dollar is the chief reserve and trading currency around the world still, even in the crypto context where you look at the stable coins backed by US treasuries or US dollars. We have to tend to those fundamental things. And I think calling on our government leaders, our representatives, to make sure we're tending carefully to the fundamentals of our economy, including our debt. Our debt can't be that big that investors and markets started to lose confidence in the U.S. economy, because it's the U.S. economy and our power that allows us to influence and to defend ourselves through the economic and financial domain.
Juan, thank you. I mean, I see you. Some will say you're an economic warrior, and I know you'll hopefully take that as a badge of honor. I think that's true, or at least a founder of so much of the tools that the U.S. has been able to use. But also, I would say you are a statesman. A great advisor. And I hope people take heed. And what you described, especially as you were talking about what we need to do as citizens, it just reminds me of the term, for us to have a more perfect union, right? Things aren't perfect, but you've outlined some ways for us to try to get there. So I appreciate that and appreciate your wisdom and your insight today.
Yeah, I'm humbled by your comments. You know how much I love and respect you, and you're one of the great experts in the space, and certainly in the crypto domain, where you staked out a place among the analysts before many people knew even what Bitcoin was. You were analyzing the threats and the risks and the opportunities, and so I want to thank you. I always learn from you, and I've been privileged to work with you. So really appreciate it.
Talking with Juan Zarate reminds me of what is at stake today when it comes to national security and economic warfare. These massive threats might sometimes seem to be abstract, disconnected from our everyday experiences, but he pointed out how tangible they are, like clicking on a link that has been placed by operatives for North Korea to try to hack funds, and how America's global economic and political power is buttressed by the integrity of its markets, sound rule of law, and the attractiveness of our environment and human capital. These things make life better for all who live here. Adversaries of the US who don't necessarily have these strengths are seeking to exploit the divisions in our social and political life. Juan urges us to be mindful of that, so we don't fall into the trap of being so focused on our differences within that we fall victim to the warfare being waged from without. I'm Yaya Jata Fanusie, and this is Designated on the Illicit Edge Network.